On opening government, we stand clear. The regions that we're talking about in the world today is where gendered violence against women is at its prime. Mostly developing countries, and the countries that most likely are going to fall under this motion are countries like Iran, Indonesia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Morocco, Jordan, those kinds of countries, right? Where the rates of violence against women, especially gendered violence, is really high. Specifically in this motion, we think the characterization of the violence and what kind of violence actually constitutes that kind of appropriate reaction is justified. We in our speeches are going to concentrate on sexual assault, acid attacks, and domestic abuse. And I'm going to go into why these kinds of attacks specifically fit under the parameters of this motion. Before that, a characterization of what vigilante justice looks like. We think the vigilante justice in these areas, as the motion, as the slide has already predicated a little bit, is going to be carried out by groups of people, groups of individual actors who are proponents of women's rights in these regions. Mostly women, also male allies. We're perfectly happy with the support of allies in that context. Opposition is going to come up and say that the physical attacks that act as vigilante justice are going to be violent. They're probably going to violate bodily autonomy. They're going to hurt people and probably damage them in the long run. We're perfectly happy to support those. We're perfectly happy to support those kinds of retributive as well as secondary physical acts of violence in terms of vigilante justice. 3 arguments for you in today's speech. Why are acts of vigilante justice of this sort justified? Secondly, why we need them, because political systems in these countries have failed. Thirdly, why people owe obligations to individuals as opposed to future generations where the gain is nebulous. Let's go straight into it. Firstly, what are the natures of these attacks, and why do we think these specifically are the kinds of attacks that warrant vigilante justice? Was there a clarification? No. Okay, all right. So, what are the nature of these attacks? We think that the reason why these attacks are the kinds that we're going to be focusing on is threefold. Firstly, because to carry out a sexual assault or to carry out an acid attack, it is not something that you do out of passion. It's not something that usually happens out of anger. These are premeditated attacks that are directed at specific individuals for reasons that are only known and make sense to the attacker themselves. It does not receive any form of condolences from the rest of society. It is not supported by the religious ideology that exists in any of these regions, if that's something opposition wants to contest, and it's something overall all people across the world consider deplorable. Secondly, to plan those kinds of attacks display a lack of moral judgment and moral abhorrence on the part of the attacker that meets no other conditions. Secondly, is the permanent nature of these attacks. Notice that acid attacks render the person's face, especially if it's attacked to the face, permanently scarred and permanently different from the rest of society. What does that mean? Every time this woman looks in the mirror, she has to contend for the rest of her life with the fact that people in society don't consider her beautiful, that she's probably never going to get married or remarried if she already is married, and the fact that she could, and the fact that she has to live with that scarred version of herself for the rest of her life. Mentally, for example, for people who suffer sexual assault, do not receive support systems from the rest of society and have to condole themselves with the fact that they were sexually assaulted, that they're inferior not only to the men in that society that they live in, but also to other women in that same society. The permanence of these attacks is really important. But thirdly, the after effects, right? Stigmatization from the rest of society because you look different or you act different or people know that something happened to you. The fact that you cannot access remarriage because no one in most of these societies doesn't even want to marry a non-virgin, let alone someone that was sexually assaulted. And thirdly, the way you look, I've already hinted at that previously. The second reason why we think it's justified is because there's a collective action problem in this region, right? Because the way in which social structures are set up necessarily means that individual women cannot access these benefits, which leads to my second argument that official structures that opposition is going to advocate for have completely and miserably failed. Why is this? Because women in many of these regions are not enfranchised. Divorce is looked upon with sufficient stigma in these societies that even if adequate divorce laws exist, there is always a predication on the part of the women to not access a divorce, to not access a lawyer, and to try not to get separated from that family, because the rest of the family, and including many of the times her parents, are going to ostracize her. The rest of society is going to ostracize her. So we think that people collectively acting in their benefit and having retributive punishment to the attacker provides some sort of catharsis. Secondly, they denied access to the economy. So working within social structures is failing because there is no one advocating sufficiently for their rights through the political system in this region. The last thing is they're denied support systems and safe spaces by generally society at large in this region. That is why we think it is imperative that we recognize that the system has failed, and the way the system exists, dominated by men, dominated by religion, who have in these societies society has always looked upon women as second-class citizens, has always looked upon women as people who don't deserve rights, and have only conceded to provide some sort of rights because of international pressure, is a reason why vigilante justice is justified. Why then physical vigilante justice? Before that, closing. Okay, fine. Individual versus future generations. They didn't ask one. I'm sorry. Okay, individual versus future generations. Fine, I'll get into that. Closing.
Can you tell me, when you say that this is in response to something, why you would also include revenge other than self-defense in your mechanism?
So we think that this is a way of self-defense as well, because of the kind of effects it takes on the rest of society. When you know that if you do this, there is likely a mob that might lynch you, that might physically attack you, that might render you physically different from than you were before. That's a calculus that men never have to perceive in these kinds of societies, because they always know that in more cases than not, and in almost all instances, they're going to get away with committing these sort of crimes because of all the reasons I pointed to you before. Why then we consider individual acts of justice? Recognize that the permanence of these attacks means that the life of this person is considerably different. And significantly worse, as my speech has pointed out to you. What this means then is we value the individual catharsis of these women, and collectively the catharsis of the group of women that have undergone these gendered assaults and gendered violence, and we value their individual right to that catharsis much higher than any nebulous gains that you gain in the political system in future that opposition is going to gain for. Why? Because advocacy for those have failed consistently in these countries, and we do not know when that advocacy is ever going to be successful. But secondly, we think that since most of this gendered violence is going to take place by groups against attackers by women themselves, that as feminists and in general nice people, we should support attackers who are morally abhorrent getting some sort of physical punishment, and women collectively and allies in these regions, insular regions, coming forward from themselves and enacting acts of revenge. And secondly, we say the deterrence value of this also is a kind of self-defense, because it prevents people from acting in the long run. The last thing is we think it's proportionate, because these attacks are so bad, very proud to propose.
Prime Minister, call leader of the opposition, note to the case.
On opposition, we recognize that sometimes trade-offs are necessary in order to achieve the best total goals, both in the short term and the long term, for individuals and for movements as a whole. With the question of trade-offs in this debate, that we're going to win out in this, that's our primary case. 2 points in the speech. First, we're going to look at the specific trade-offs with the justice system and why that's harmful. And second of all, we're going to prove to you that how this is net negative harmful to women who live in these areas. After that, a little bit of direct rebuttal on the Prime Minister's speech. So first, trade-offs within the justice system. So how does that happen? Because now individuals are acting outside of the law, at the point when they're necessarily taking vigilante actions for themselves, they're necessarily abandoning legal bedrocks that do protect them in some instances. We agree that the legal protections are not good. We do think that there are some legal protections baked into the system that are of utility. You necessarily push all of them away and reject the entire justice system with the actions that the government is proposing. We also think that you taint the image in general that the law can succeed, because you say that inherently the law is ineffective at the point when you push yourself and your movement outside of the bounds of the law. That in general, this stints the push for legal change that we're seeing happening via Islamic feminism in many of these nations that has been causing positive progress, that you necessarily stint that and stop those gains. So what happens in the short terms with the justice system trade-off? We think you get less legal protection in the short term for all of these individual women. We think that the alternative is we recognize again that the alternative is not great, but there is some legal protection for against some of these actions for some individuals. I think you lose that at the point when you reject the system inherently. We also think that you are going to generally alienate other individuals who are not part of your specific movement, who might have sympathetic changes towards different policy changes, necessarily alienating them from helping you, because you're no longer advocating for those same types of policy changes. It's easier for them to get behind. For individuals who don't want to support violence, but also generally want to support policy changes, you alienate those types of allies. Not yet. We also think when we looked at the long-term trade-offs, though, we just generally don't get any type of systemic justice change. We think the systemic justice policy, Justice Department, and justice system change is the best overall end goal, and that you cannot get that at the point when you necessarily push the justice system away and go on your own, because these types of actions are inherently anti the system. No offense. We also think that when we're looking long-term, that just in general, you entrench violence in these societies. At the point when you don't get any type of justice system change because you're no longer accessing that system, then you trap yourself in a perpetual system where you have to continue to have these vigilante acts, because there is no protection and no way to break out of the system where the people with power are still going to be oppressing you and still doing the horrible acts that the PM describes to you in this debate. And in general, you just entrench that violence and don't have a good way to get out of it in the long term. No. Actually, yeah, back up.
All right, so like this is just a mischaracterization of how these assaults happen. These are assaults that happen in back rooms away from where transparency exists. He tells you that we're going to entrench violence. I don't know that violence could be possibly more entrenched. We're even talking about the United States, I think, in this debate in places where violence against women is widespread. And unless they give you a compelling alternative, they can't win the debate.
Right, okay, but the difference is, like, we recognize that a lot of violence does happen in those backgrounds that you described. The difference is that in many of those states, there is some push, not a lot of push, but growing push in terms of, like, the goals of Islamic feminism to, like, get more people behind laws, to make those types of background actions illegal. Like, in general, that's the trade-off. Like, yeah, we agree that, we recognize that in the status quo, a lot of people can't access, like, the best parts of the system, but we do think, like, you necessarily trade off with all, like, just, trade off the entire system on government. Okay. Second point, how does this come out to be, like, net negative to women? So we look, first of all, at individuals, and second of all, like, all women in these nations. So first of all, individuals who carry out these actions. We recognize like two ways that these can be carried out. The primary way that women, like these women who were abused, specifically carry out the violence themselves in like retaliating against gendered violence. Several problems here. First of all, we think these individuals are necessarily going to internalize guilt and complicity at the point when you're like killing or like maiming another individual. We think like this just generally causes like large psychological harm to the individual at any point when you necessarily go through this. We think like this is an intrinsic harm that like government's just going to have to bite. We think it's rather harmful for the individual who goes through this. Like just in general, like there are just long-term psychological harms attached to that. But in addition, we also think that this type of violence is like coercive in the fact that you be like if the majority of women who are beginning to take part in this action, you get into a double bind. Where if you don't take this action and you're seen as like leaving yourself in harm's way because you're not taking actions to defend yourself at the point where they're defending that's the only way to defend yourself. Or in the alternative, you bite back into the harms where you necessarily like ending up like internalizing guilt as a result of taking these actions. Neither of these outcomes are preferable, and like one of these outcomes is necessary under the system where like this becomes like the norm that they're defending. But lastly, we just think that, but third, we think this just in general justifies like the general narrative of women in these nations, like that they need to be like put in their place because they're going anti the norms. Right? At the point when you have individuals who are like retaliating in violence, like that just enforces the narrative that like the majority needs to continue pushing these individuals back out of power because like the way that they're trying to handle it. And lastly, we just think there's like very real chance that the individuals who try and retaliate in this violence have like a severe harm to themselves. The person that they're attacking might like fight back or kill them in the process. And like that's entirely likely at the point when the women who are carrying this out have the little legal protection or like little that they can turn to. In addition to just like that person that they're retaliating against seem to like to commit violence in the first place. I think there is a large risk of physical harm to the individual who carries this out. The alternative we see is the chance that like others carry out the violence on women's behalf. This is very problematic in that it reinforces power dynamic that like women can't take care of themselves and can't get out of these situations on their own, which is problematic. And it also reinforces the idea that like masculinity is tied to like ownership or responsibility for like protecting women in these cultures. Both these are harmful. We think that like regardless of the circumstance, this is going to be net negative to women. So how does this hurt all women? This is the backlash point we identify here. So basically, when we look like internally in that country, I think that you just generally get less push for legal rights. This is building off the trade-off with the justice system argument. But the idea is basically that this specific group is no longer seen as victims. They're seen as like advocates who are like breaking the law. In general, it's much easier to get advocacy to push for change for individuals who are like publicly seen as like a group of victims or a group of people who need to be protected versus individuals who are breaking the law in their own right. But second of all, we think that when we look at the general narrative, like just generally enforces the narrative in these nations that like women are like reactionary or like have a specific place they need to be put into or like denied rights to do things like this. I mean, in general, like this type of narrative happens and gets entrenched because these nations specifically are places where like the dominant narrative in like the media is controlled by men, who believe this and largely like carry out these actions. This is just generally harmful and problematic, and just like at the point where like there is no way to like try and break that power structure and form your own narrative. At the point where you're necessarily going against the system as opposed to working within it. Okay, on the PM speech. So in terms of whether or not these are justified, we are certainly not defending these attacks in any mechanism. We completely agree as to how horrific these acts are. But we don't think that like individual violence is the best response. We also don't like the bright line set up by the Prime Minister's speech. Like basically the only bright line they give to vigilantism is anything of a permanent nature. We think pretty much all violence, or like any murder, is of a permanent nature. This is not like at all specific to like gendered violence. I'm not sure like why this bright line is necessarily just this debate, but not like just a general defense of vigilantism as a whole. We think like the little bit higher burden that they gave themselves than they needed to. On the second point, in terms of like denying economic access, like yeah, we agree the system is bad, but we think the system is getting a lot better in the status quo than it was in the past. There are like internal mechanisms of change that are working to some degree, via like various benefits that Islamic feminism has been able to argue for in terms of improving like daily quality of life. The system is not fully broken. At that point, we think it's better to keep using that system. On this last point about the obligation to the individual now versus the future, but we think that it's not just an issue of like valuing the catharsis now versus the future. We think like in general, we just value less attacks in totality more. We think like just in general, like the constructive we gave you is showing how this is worse for women in general. We think that at the point when you increase the amount of gendered violence, you just like in general have more attacks from both fronts against individuals, and like more individuals in totality are harmed. We think that's worse net harm than individuals being able to access catharsis if like more net women are attacked via these acid attacks and retaliation for like the retaliation that occurred. But in general, we think that better long-term change is preferable over like some short-term harms now for like continued goals that Islamic feminism is being able to generate. For all these reasons, proud to stand in opposition.
currently being affected by the violence in these areas are women who have absolutely been torn to shambles by the acts of violence and oppression that have put onto them. Recognize that these are women who have been raped, attacked, systematically killed, oppressed, have acid poured on their faces. We think that for these women, they need to have some sort of emotional catharsis that exists. These women need some way to be able to regain their self-worth. We ultimately think that we are in support of these women regaining power within their own lives. That's ultimately what we support today on government. A couple things for you today for my speech. Firstly, we're going to talk specifically a little bit more about why this justice for these specific women who have been attacked ultimately comes first in this round. Then I'm going to go and do some refutation of what we heard come out of opening opposition. Let's talk about these specific women. Understand that these women have been so horrifically and morally wrong, that they've been killed and oppressed for centuries, attacked simply for being of the lesser gender, simply because they were random during the genetic lottery, being born as a female. And recognize that, and Ankur tells you this in his speech, that the emotional effect that this ultimately has them is absolutely damaging, right? This changes the way that they view themselves, the way that they view their body, the way that they act for the rest of their life. This is something that is so scarring that we would say that even if we were able to repair this type of damage to some extent, we would say that is worth it on our side of the house, right? We think that for these individual women, having some sort of justice, even if that justice exists in a violent form that is out to act for revenge, we think that's justified to be able to grant them this emotional catharsis to some extent, right? We think that this type of justice is empowering for these women who feel like they are now at the very bottom of the totem pole of life, that they are worthless. We think to some extent this is something that is worthy on our side of the house, but that we would recognize to be able to feel human again, to be able to feel like they deserve their life and who they are as an individual, that this is enough to put their values currently above potential change that no one will know will ever happen in the future, above this type of action, right? Okay, now let's move on to some refutation of what we heard come out of the other side, right? Let's look at a couple of ideas. Firstly, essentially, they tell you there's a trade-off in the justice system that exists when you chose to go into this route. Firstly, they tell you that, look, this exists outside the law. Two responses. Firstly, I would say that the law doesn't matter to exist outside of law, because anything that we do would exist outside of the law, right? The reason that we're turning to this extent is because there are no systems within the law that actually act to help them. When all the judges and politicians and lawyers are all males who will not sympathize with your cause, you have no route to access the law in the first place, right? That's why they're placed outside it. But secondly, we would tell you that this is, if they potentially even had access to the law, this isn't even mutually exclusive, right? We're talking about places where individuals don't have that access and don't have that support system, which is the reason why the violence is so bad in the first place, because they did have that access. We would say that, in the instance where they did have access to the law, they'd be taking advantage of that. We think that, it would just not get to this extent, right? They essentially tell you, look, you eliminate the opportunity for systematic change within the justice system, and ultimately what you get is an entrenchment of violence within these communities. I would say a couple of things. Firstly, I think that violence is already entrenched with these communities because no one has ever done anything about it, right? And these individuals just take this as a norm, right? We see, for example, pouring acid on women's faces. No one thinks of that, has a second thought about that in a lot of these communities, because no one has ever challenged these types of situations, either within necessarily a legal system within that area, or even just individual members of the community speaking up in that sense, right? So we would say that this violence is already entrenched, and men feel like they have the right to be able to do this. But furthermore, I think until opposition gives you a viable